Welcome to Where Stories Meet, a storytelling podcast based here in Abingdon, Virginia. On today's episode, we have some short stories by David Winship. He'll be coming back a few times to tell us some more stories about the history of Abingdon.
Let's go and
Let's
see
go.
what we
Hey,
got.
David Winship, thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be here, Adam. This is fun.
David Winship is here to tell some small tales. These are stories of Abingdon and Washington County, drawn from historical bases, told with imagination, drawing on resources of the Historical Society of Washington County, the Washington County Public Library, and other local histories. David Winship, who's been around for a while, tells these tales before they are lost to the dustbins of history. Abingdon, like any place, has stories that have been repeated and adjusted so many times that we think they are true. Most all histories have a root truth, but the liberty and challenge to embellish has brought about different versions of history. Small Tales tries to bring into the light neglected, ignored, and forgotten bits of our past, to hear now and to consider and enjoy for the future. David, thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, Adam. I'm glad to have a chance to put together some of these stories.
Yeah, we're gonna have you throughout this. This podcast is a new platform for us at the tourism department, and we're gonna have you back and do a whole series of these small tales.
Well, I think that'll be fun.
Yeah. So, what you got for us today?
So this small tale is an addition to the King's Mountain story that we tell here in Abingdon. We tell about the threat from Ferguson, the mustering of the militia, the march over the mountain to defeat the British and turn the tide for independence. What we don't tell is the story of those behind the scenes, those who make history happen. Some stories are forgotten and some are ignored. This is the story about two men whose rides after that threat was delivered carried the communications that influenced the decision to call out the militia. You could say these are our Paul Reveres. It includes the role of Moses Shelby, the younger teenage brother of Isaac Shelby. Now, these two were sons of Evan Shelby, who was the first of the Shelbys, one of the first settlers in the Bristol area. And the role that Moses played in carrying the need for Washington County militia to come and join the gathering forces to go and confront Ferguson at Kings Mountain. And the story also tells about the role of Martin Gambill, who was a lieutenant in the Wilkes County, North Carolina militia, and his part in the important decision to muster the Washington County militia to march over mountain to Battle of Kings Mountain. So let's go back to the year 1779. Here in the backcountry where we live, the main problem was the attacks from the native populations. It was not simply that the colonial white settlers were coming in violation of a treaty, the Treaty of 1763, between the British and the native tribes. These were primarily the Cherokee, but the Shawnee also claimed the region for hunting more than settling. The Cherokee were to the southwest and the Shawnee were to the northwest. But the hunting was good here, and the trade routes ran through here. So both were parts of an economy, both tribes were parts of an economy and a culture that they shared in dynamic cooperation. The complicating factor was that the British were encouraging the Cherokee to attack the settlers on the Holston, and in response to those attacks, the colonial militia from Washington County was being called out to repel and attack the native tribes and their towns. So in the summer of 1779, Colonel Evan Shelby and Captain Isaac Shelby, who both lived at Fort Shelby, which is located at Sapling Spring, which would become Bristol, they were in command of a regiment from Washington County militia, which marched against the Cherokee towns in Chickamauga. And the resulting carnage just alleviated some of the immediate threat from the west. The following year brought the threat from the east. Now, there were some of the settlers in the backcountry who supported the British and were opposed to the colonial efforts for independence. These Tories, as they were called, put up resistance to the Patriot movement. They acted in guerrilla bands attacking Patriot industrial supplies, such as the lead mines on the New River at Fort Chiswell. So in the summer of 1780, the British forces of Cornwallis, this is over at the coast, they were pushing north through Carolina, intending to make it to Virginia. This was after the capture of Charleston. Colonel Patrick Ferguson of the British forces was on the move in western North Carolina, but he was being pestered by colonists and the colonial militias affiliated with the militia of McDowell of western North Carolina. Ferguson was expecting to extinguish the settlers' threat in short order, and it was proving difficult. His hostility towards the Over-Mountain men grew. He knew that one of the instigators was Isaac Shelby. Ferguson had captured a Whig, which is what the Patriot forces were called, who was a cousin of Isaac Shelby, a man named Samuel Phillips. He told Phillips to carry a message to Shelby, and the message read, "If you do not desist from your opposition to the British arms, he, Ferguson, would march his army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay your country waste with fire and sword." So this was in the week of September 18th, 1780. Ferguson expected this threat would send the colonists scurrying for cover to surrender. It had just the opposite effect. Isaac Shelby immediately sent word to the other militia leaders in the backcountry, John Sevier in the Jonesboro area and William Campbell in Virginia. McDowell and his militia had retreated over the mountains to the Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River, which is where Shelby sent word to him. The militias of the backcountry needed to gather and join forces to march against the British for the sake of their lives. Moses Shelby, the teenage kid brother of Isaac, took the message to William Campbell at 7 Mile Ford. Ferguson's threat was real. The Washington County militia needed to be called out. So Moses Shelby had to ride hard from essentially Bristol to just this side of Marion in 7 Mile Ford. Captain William Campbell lived at Aspenvale there at 7 Mile Ford. Now it's called that because it's 7 miles down the middle fork of the Holston River from Royal Oak, which is now Marion, which was where Arthur Campbell lived. So it was late summer, early in September in 1780, and Campbell had just returned with a force of 150 of the men from Washington County militia who had fought the Tories, seeking to wreck the lead mines. William Campbell received the message, but sent the message back by Moses that since they just returned from Austinville lead mines, he was going to wait to confront Ferguson when he came into Virginia. Moses, who had ridden that 40-plus miles from Fort Shelby to Aspenvale, now had to take a message back to his brother with failed results. Moses would have been fully aware of the discussions following the receipt of the threat, the actions that had been set in motion in communication with Sevier and McDowell, and he was aware of what was happening in a way that no one else was. So he rode hard back to Fort Shelby to deliver the message that Colonel Campbell would not be mustering out the militia. That was a hard message to deliver, if you can only imagine. When Isaac Shelby received Campbell's refusal, he was not deterred, but I bet he was probably irritated. He had to try again, and he did. He sent another, even more emphatic message to Campbell, emphasizing whatever ways he could that the Washington County militia was needed to march over the mountain to defeat Ferguson. And Moses carried this message on his return ride. At the same time, Isaac Shelby sent messages to Arthur Campbell at Royal Oak and to William Christian, who commanded at Fort Chiswell, and both were leaders in the Washington County government and militia, but it was William Campbell that Isaac Shelby knew was in charge. Now let me tell you about Ben Cleveland and Martin Gambill. Colonel Ben Cleveland commanded the Patriot forces in Wilkes County in western North Carolina. He was a large, imposing man who commanded from a mountain outpost called Rendezvous Mountain, which can still be visited outside Wilkesboro. From this vantage point overlooking the Piedmont, he could see hundreds of miles south along the eastern flank of the mountains. In preparation for Ferguson's attack, he had positioned preset brush piles on the summits of the knobs of the Piedmont. These were to be torched as a signal that Ferguson was advancing, the message sent by fire and smoke. And on 19th of September, 1780, the fires were set, and the signal was sent that Ferguson was moving. Now, Cleveland had worked with William Campbell in earlier battles with the British. He knew he had to get word to Campbell that Washington County militia was needed. He asked for a volunteer to ride to alert and recruit Campbell and his militia. Lieutenant Martin Gambill volunteered. Gambill had a farm on the New River, and he knew the way to 7 Mile Ford. Given his orders, Gambill left in the middle of the night to ride into Virginia. Gambill stopped briefly at his farm, then plunged his horse into the New River to get across to his neighbor Enoch Osborne's farm on the other side. Now, in September of 1780, the snows of winter had arrived early, and the mountaintops were snow-covered. The snow melt that fed the New River was icy cold. Gambill's horse, after its hard ride, had a heart attack when it hit that icy water, and when he gained ground on the far side, he collapsed and died. It was early morning, and Enoch Osborne was in the field already. Osborne quickly unhitched his plow horse, put Gambill's tack on the horse, and sent Gambill on his way to Aspenvale. Around Thomas Bridge, Osborne's horse gave out, unprepared for a long, hard ride. Gambill secured a third horse, and 24 hours after he had left Rendezvous Mountain, he arrived at William Campbell's house, arriving at the same time as Moses Shelby on his return mission, as well as the couriers from Arthur Campbell and William Christian. The combination of these messages overcame William Campbell's hesitancy, and the call went out for the Washington County militia to gather at the muster ground in Abingdon along Wolf Creek and not far from Bradley's Tavern. One can only imagine the gathering of the militia, from which an initial 200 men were sent to rendezvous at Sycamore Shoals on September 24th. Arthur Campbell, unsure about whether that was enough men to carry out the mission, then followed with an additional 200 men, arriving just in time to gather and march over the mountain to join forces with Colonel Ben Cleveland's Wilk militia coming south to confront and defeat Ferguson and the British forces, made primarily of Tories, at the Battle of Kings Mountain on October 7th, 1780. So we've heard stories of leaders like the Campbells, Sevier, McDowell, and Cleveland, and we've heard fewer stories about those men who really made history happen. This is simply one of those small tales of backcountry history.
Fantastic, David. Thank you for sharing that story.
Well, good. I'm glad it came through. It's one of those fill in the gaps in their history that we have around here.
Yeah, and so we were kind of discussing earlier, if that had not everyone arrived at that time, then he would maybe been overtaken with the motion to actually get the militia together to go.
Well, I don't know that he would have had the encouragement from others, because the Campbells and Christian shared the leadership of the militia here in Washington County. Each would go on a different time. For instance, I spoke of when the Shelbys led the incursions against the Indian towns, the native towns. It was sometimes that that Arthur Campbell would lead the attacks on the Indian towns, and William Campbell would lead the attacks on the Tory and the British forces, because Arthur Campbell had been captured as a youngster and spent several years in Indian camps under the influence of the French. This was the Shawnee that had captured him, and he had escaped. So he had a lifelong hatred of the native tribes, whoever they were.
Right. Now, how did, so I guess during the midnight ride, you leave at midnight because there was...
Well, you left sometime in the dark.
Because of opposing forces were all around.
Well, he just knew that he had to go fast.
Okay,
At that time, coming from either Sapling Grove or Bristol up the road, he would have come up Reedy Creek and then come up the what we call the Wilderness Road, or coming over from Rendezvous Mountain. There weren't British forces around. They just needed to make time.
Okay.
Because the British forces were still on the other side of the mountain, and the Tories had been pretty much defeated.
Okay.
Which are some other stories that are worth telling.
Because you said that there was a Western pressure, and so
the Western pressure from the natives, but the East, and they were defeated.
How were the British getting their message and the persuasion?
They lived with the natives. They were the ones that had made the treaties, and so they had agents there in the Cherokee towns that were feeding them information, giving them encouragement to attack the settlers.
So you really had to trust the people you talked to about this plan.
Well, and he knew. Shelby knew his other leaders, and so the story is that when he sent word to Sevier was at a party down in Jonesboro because he had just gotten married, and this was saying, we've got to go ahead and make our move now, or our lives and our families and our livelihoods are going to be in trouble.
Wow. And just a teenager.
Moses was simply a teenage kid, but he could ride.
Yeah. Well, David, we'd love to have you back for another small tale.
Well, thank you.
And
I look forward to the opportunity.
Can you give us do you have something in mind?
I do have one in mind.
What can we look forward to?
This is about Abingdon going hog wild.
That sounds great.
And some other stories, too.
Well, we look forward to that. Thank you so much for your time today.
You're so very, very welcome, Adam. I'm glad to be here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. See ya.